Alright, so my show and tell today is on the types of legitimate domination by Max Weber. His core argument in this reading is that systems of domination try to establish legitimacy in order to ensure their continuance. There are three types of legitimate domination: rational, traditional, and charismatic. But first of all, we have to define what Weber means by domination and legitimacy. So domination is defined as the probability that commands will be obeyed by a given group of persons. So domination is therefore not necessarily every form of power or influence, because it relies on the compliance of the individual. So that compliance could be through rational calculation of advantage, or it could just be because they feel like it, or because they've always done it that way. But there is inevitably an interest in obedience. Weber defines legitimacy as a belief system that validates the commands given by authority figures. So Weber points out that domination does not simply appeal to the material, ideal, or effectual motives of its followers, but it also attempts to establish legitimacy. So really we should go back to the core argument and just tweak it a little bit to specify that there are actually three types of claims to legitimacy, which are rational, traditional, and charismatic. And by exploring these three types of claims to legitimacy, we can see how social structures and institutions are maintained and able to exert power in society. Remember, Weber was concerned with interpretive understanding, how individuals operate within certain contexts, and how they assign meaning to situations or behavior. Also, types of legitimate domination deals with these quote-unquote ideal examples of domination, which Weber recognized did not exist in the pure form in the real world. Rather, he kind of set up these categories as structures through which you could take real-world examples and examine them through and see how they fit into each category. So the first type is legal or rational authority. So the belief system of which legitimacy is produced for legal or rational authority is that of rational thought and action that serves ideal or material ends. So for instance, a business that is for profit or a state government. And Weber lays out 5 interdependent ideas that are inherent in the pure form of legal authority. First one being, a legal norm may be established on the basis of expediency, so convenience or practicality, and or value rationality, so pertaining to a value maintained by rationality, and applies to all or part of the territorial bodies. So in other words, it would apply to the state if it was a government, or a company if it was a CEO making that decision. It's basically saying that laws serve to be practical and convenient and uphold a rational ideal. So you can see how he would be kind of weary of this, and you could see how this could create an iron cage of sorts. Secondly, laws are essentially rules that are consistent with each other and are created intentionally. So administration of the law is consistent with the rules of law. And there's an obvious discrepancy there between the ideal type and the real world example when you consider something like police brutality. Thirdly, the superior is subject to the law and must orient their actions, dispositions, and commands to it. Fourth, the person who obeys the authority does so in his capacity as a member of the organization. So for example, a citizen of Canada is not subject to US law. And fifth and finally, the superior commands obedience because of their status within the organization rather than their qualities as an individual. So for example, when a new prime minister is elected, we cease to be obedient to the old prime minister. Finally, his last little point here is that pure rational authority uses a bureaucratic administrative staff, meaning that their staff is appointed, treated, and expected to behave rationally. So one can see why Weber was very weary of rationalization, because basically, as I just described, he's kind of exploring how rationality is just this vicious cycle that maintains its position of power and creates the iron cage around those within its ranks. It's a very impersonal system where it's not reliant on individuality, but rather interchangeable figures to fill roles within the system. So a second type of authority is traditional authority. Beliefs producing legitimacy for traditional authority are founded on the sanctity of age-old rules and powers. So essentially reliant on personal loyalty due to, as he mentions, common upbringing. So in other words, socialization. Individuals are obedient to the person who occupies the position of authority, whose commands are legitimized by the traditions which directly determine the content of the command, but are also up to the discretion of the master on the basis that their subjects will remain loyal. Therefore, when a master oversteps their boundaries, followers will blame the individual rather than the system as a whole. So a great example of this is Pope Francis's commendation of same-sex civil union, which has traditionally been very opposed by the Catholic Church. He's kind of breaking out of that mold and saying, well, maybe it's sort of okay, and he's feeling a lot of backlash for that. And then the third type of authority is charismatic authority. The charismatic authority is a figure with exemplary powers that can inspire individuals. So legitimacy for charismatic authority relies on the subjects of the authority to feel a duty to recognize the greatness of the charismatic leader. This could be brought on by feelings of enthusiasm, hope, or despair, to name a few. As long as the leader receives recognition from the followers, they maintain legitimacy. Charismatic authority is, quote, specifically irrational in the sense of being foreign to all rules, unquote, meaning that it is outside of the realm of rational or traditional authority and sort of revolutionary in that sense. Charismatic authority repudiates any sort of involvement with the everyday routine world, including economic pursuits. Weber states that charisma has the ability to reorient the subjective viewpoints of an individual, shifting their values and outlook on the world. And that is how it can be such a powerful revolutionary force. However, the existence of charismatic authority outside of the spheres of the everyday routine world sort of contradicts itself, as that charismatic authority, that ideal, becomes routinized. So as it becomes kind of more widely accepted, it either becomes rationalized or traditionalized. For instance, Weber points out how the need for succession after a charismatic leader dies sort of requires a rationally structured administration, some sort of hierarchy within the ranks, in order to ensure another leader. So kind of looking at the reading as a whole, Weber is kind of suggesting a system not unlike the Hegelian dialectic, where the thesis of the rational or the traditional authority gets challenged by the antithesis of the charismatic authority, but eventually they both kind of synthesize to embody qualities of each. He's also kind of a post-structuralist in a way, in how he's regarding the creation of knowledge. He's exploring how what we conceive of as legitimate forms of domination are actually socially constructed dialogues perpetuated by institutions. And he's also kind of recognizing how powerful capitalism is in the current social order. So he's kind of suggesting that adaptation to capitalism is necessary for survival of an ideological following, and recognizing just the power that capitalism has in current social order. So for my personal example, or real-world example, I've chosen an article from CTV News about Greta Thunberg. Article is kind of about this research that has come out that stated that people are inspired by Greta Thunberg to take action to reduce global warming, and it is augmented by their belief in collective efficacy, which is a psychological phenomenon that when a group believes they can achieve a result, they are actually indeed much better at achieving it. So Greta Thunberg represents charismatic authority in the sense that her exemplary dedication to climate justice, so something like, crossing the Atlantic in a sailboat rather than flying, or protesting outside of the Swedish parliament for weeks on end, that kind of charismatic authority inspired the Fridays for the Future climate activism movement, as well as global climate activism protests. Her actions are irrational in the sense that they are contrary to the current rational understanding of climate change as an issue to be dealt with kind of later on down the line. She brings this kind of urgency and gravity to the discourse. Her protesting, specifically on school days, also kind of exemplifies her detachment from an established order. The rational thought would be, teenage girls aren't supposed to be protesting climate change, they're supposed to be in school. And I had an actually interesting conversation with some people about Greta Thunberg during the climate strike in Montreal, and they were very hung up on the fact that in their eyes, she didn't actually do anything, which I thought was quite interesting, because Weber actually writes that the revolutionary force of reason, so the revolutionary force of rationality, works from without, which is to say, by altering the situations of life and hence its problems, finally in this way changing men's attitudes toward them. So reason relies on sort of concrete results that show the logical understanding of achieving these results. So rather than admiring the charismatic quality of Thunberg's leadership and drive for change, these people who didn't quite appreciate what she was doing sort of reasonably concluded that she's not worthy of being a leader because she hasn't done anything concrete. So I thereby couldn't help but question why they were even at the demonstration in the first place. And the only thing I could come up with was that they probably just felt pressured into it. They felt social pressures that they had to attend. Which brings me to my 3 questions. First one is, in the internet era, does charismatic authority still require a single charismatic leader? For example, movements such as Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter were largely decentralized and gained traction by connecting people over social media with shared ideological beliefs. Is this still charismatic authority, or is this something completely different? Routinization of charisma requires the adherence to the economic system in order to ensure its continuation. So is a communist revolution or any other ideological revolution that usurps capitalism able to be produced under charismatic authority? And my final question is, what are the shortcomings and benefits of the revolutionary process of reason?